Our Bible reading this evening is from Mark's Gospel. If you have a Bible somewhere near you, you might like to follow. It's on page 1023, and it's Mark chapter 15, starting at verse 42. Page 1023, Mark 15, verse 42. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Okay, yeah. Can you hear me? Good, great stuff. Hi, my name's John Risbridger, one of the ministers here, and it's brilliant to see you all here this evening. We're going to think for a few minutes about that bit of the Bible that's just been read to us and why it's so incredibly relevant for our lives, because it really, really is. It was about 15 years ago, almost exactly 15 years ago. I lived in Nottingham at the time, and a letter popped through my letterbox onto the doormat. I've still got a copy of it. There it is up on the screen. And so I went down, opened the envelope, and read it. It was a letter from two of the people who were then leaders of this church here. And the letter was asking me if I was willing to come to Above Bar as the new team member and join in the team here. So I read it. Big smile on my face, because for me, this was incredibly good news. I'm not sure it's such good news for the church, but that's for other people to say. But for me, it was wonderfully good news. And actually, it was good news that changed everything for me, pretty much everything. It meant a new city, a new home, new friends, a new job, just a whole new focus and new direction for my life. Good news that changed everything. That's really what Charlotte has discovered. We've heard her amazing story this evening. She's discovered the good news. She thought that she wasn't the kind of person that Jesus would ever be interested in. And she's discovered the good news that she's exactly the kind of person that Jesus is interested in. And that good news has changed everything for Charlotte, as she's already explained so powerfully. And that is really what Easter is all about. It's about good news that changes everything. The good news that Jesus didn't stay dead on the cross or buried in the ground, but that after 3 days he rose to life, and that because he broke through the power of death, he can give us new life, life that lasts forever as well. Amazingly good news, and good news that changes everything. Now, you may say, it sounds good, and I can tell that some of you Christians get a little bit excited about this. Believe me, we really do. But to be honest, it's just a bit too difficult to believe. I can't quite take it on board. Well, lots of people have felt like that. It sounds kind of unlikely. Just want to say one thing, though. That is, the little bit of the Bible that we've just read tells us that the first three people to express their faith in Jesus were the last people you would ever have expected to believe in him. Let me tell you who they were, these unlikely early adopters who first put their trust in Jesus. The first one was a Roman soldier who had just crucified Jesus. It's actually a couple of verses before the bit that we read. He had been involved in putting him to death, and when he saw the way he died, he said, goodness me, this really was the Son of God. You wouldn't have expected that, would you? The guy who's just killed him, and he starts to believe in him. The next people I want to mention are the group of grieving women that went to the tomb expecting to anoint Jesus' dead body with spices. They thought he was dead and gone, and they just wanted to respect their friend. And they discovered he was alive. And their story began to change the world. And then the third person was a guy called Joseph, who we read about in the first few verses there, who was a member of the kind of political Jewish thing at the time. It was called the Sanhedrin. And he was a leading light in that. And that was the very group that had just condemned Jesus to death 2 or 3 days later. And Joseph puts his trust in Jesus. You would not have expected any of those people to believe in Jesus, would you? No. Okay, I wouldn't have expected any of them to. Totally unlikely, and yet these first three people to put their faith in the risen Jesus actually were the first to believe, and you really wouldn't have thought of it at all. So if you're in that place where you think, I am the last person who would ever become a Christian, who would ever be interested in God, just remember what Charlotte said earlier. She thought she was the last person who would ever become a Christian. And look what God's done in her life. And think about these three people, the last people you'd ever expected to become Christians. And I want to say, whoever you are, whatever your background, don't write yourself out of the good news script of Easter. It is for you, just as it's for me. And it's good news that will change everything. I think about some of the other people that have become Christians here in recent years. I think of a guy called Nick, who's a scientist and an atheist and believed in all the Richard Dawkins stuff and came here because he thought the girls were pretty. Honestly, it's really true. And he ended up becoming a Christian. I think about my friend who was a very wealthy businessman from a Hindu background. You'd never expected him to become a Christian, but he heard the good news and he put his trust in Jesus. I think about my friend Sue, who described herself as a neo-pagan white witch. I remember a random conversation with her in the lounge, first time she came to church. And now she's become a Christian as well. I remember another lady from a Muslim background who'd just arrived in this country. You'd never have expected her to become a Christian. A few months later, she did. Don't write yourself out of the Easter script. It's good news for you, even if you think it's just for other people. And just could be that this evening you're going to discover good news that will change everything for you. So let's look with the open minds to see for ourselves whether this stack up. Let's think first of all about the facts that change everything. The facts that change everything. Actually, there was a film a few years ago called This Changes Everything. It was a film and a book, and it was released in 2015. And it was all about global warming and climate change, which has been in the news a lot this week. And it's basically saying, look, there are some massive facts out there. Here was one of them. 20% of the world's population are responsible for over 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So those most affected by climate change are least responsible for it. That was the basic point. And they say these facts, if we'll take them seriously, have to change everything. There's this nice little quote from the film. What if global warming isn't just a crisis? What if it's the best chance we'll ever get to build a better world? In other words, face the facts and let them change everything. And of course, we've seen very similar arguments going on the streets of London this week, haven't we, with the Extinction Rebellion protests happening. And the film then tells stories of people trying to rise to this challenge, while most of us, they say, just keep our heads in the sand. We don't want to look at the facts because it's too uncomfortable. But if we'll face the facts, they'll change everything. That's really what the film was saying. Now, actually, the film and the book, they got mixed reviews, and it's not my job to defend them, although it does seem to me clearer and clearer that these are things we've got to take seriously. But the idea of facts, which, if we'll face them, will change everything, but the most of us spend most of our lives trying to ignore, that resonates really strongly with Easter. Facts, which, if we will face them, will change everything, but most of us try to ignore them most of the time. That really is the story of Easter. Do you remember what was said to those grieving women at the tomb? Chapter 16, verse 6. Don't be alarmed, the angel said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He's risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. Come and have a look. See the facts. Look at the evidence. Let's just look at a few of the facts that could change everything. First fact, Jesus really, really did die. Mark 15, verse 44. Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus was already dead. Summoning the centurion, that's the guy who had just killed him, he asked if Jesus had already died. And when he learned from the centurion it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. There are actually 3 witnesses here that tell us Jesus had really died. Pilate, the guy who had tried him, the centurion, the man who had killed him, who was very experienced in this stuff, and then Joseph, the guy who buried him. All 3 of them tell us he definitely had died. Actually, the Romans crucified hundreds of thousands of people, and there is not one known example amongst all those hundreds of thousands of somebody being crucified by the Romans, reviving and going on to survive. It just doesn't happen. Jesus had really died. This was no mere recovery in the cool of the tomb. The second fact is that the first witnesses of the resurrection had actually seen him die and seen where he was buried. You may have noticed that the same women that were there at the cross and at the tomb where he was buried are the women that see him at the same tomb on Easter morning. In other words, there's no scope for confusion. Same people, they're seeing everything that's happened. Third fact is a kind of interesting one, that they weren't expecting a resurrection. Chapter 16, verse 1, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. If you think that your friend is about to rise from the dead, and if you're hoping against hope that they will, and you're going to their grave, why would you take spices to anoint their body? You wouldn't do it, would you? No, you take spices to anoint a dead body. That's what they did. That was their custom at the time, their way of honoring their friends. And then their minds were blown when they discovered that this Jesus who they expected to find dead had actually come back to life. In other words, this isn't just wishful thinking, just believing what they want to believe. No, they were more shocked than anybody. Fact number 4. The first witnesses were women. You probably noticed that as we read through. Why is that significant? Well, if you were making up a story like this in the first century world, you would never have put women as the first witnesses. Because in that world, the testimony of women was not respected. So you just wouldn't have done that if you were making this up. But the whole point is, it isn't made up. Mark, who wrote this stuff down, is just telling us what happened. It was the women that first discovered he was alive. In other words, this isn't just a made-up story. It has the ring of truth. Number 5, the tomb, the grave, was empty. Don't be alarmed, the angel said. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He's risen. He is not here. The grave was empty. Now, of course, it could be that he was in the grave and then some people came and nicked the body. Let's just think about that one for a moment. His friends, we know from what we've read before, were scared witless by what's happening and had done a runner. There is no way that they were going to come and steal his body. What about his enemies? Well, if his enemies had stolen the body, then the moment that the idea got out that he was alive, all they had to do was say, here's the body. But they couldn't, because there was no body, because Jesus had risen. The tomb really was empty. There was no dead body. And then the final fact is that the risen Jesus has transformed so many people's lives. We've heard Charlotte's story this evening, a story of complete transformation, because this living Jesus is still alive and still doing stuff in people's lives. But it's been like this right from the beginning. Jesus appeared to many people. Verse 7 of chapter 16, "Go," the angel said to the women, "tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." In other words, the risen Jesus didn't just leave a space in a tomb. No, he actually appeared to people. They saw him, they met him, they ate with him, he spoke to them, they encountered him. And the impact on them was phenomenal, life-changing, literally. Let me just tell you three things to just underline this. If you look at the history, if you look at the documents, it's crystal clear that within about 10 years or so of the death of Jesus, the church was definitely proclaiming his resurrection. Now, it could have been much, much earlier, but you can look at the documents, you can figure it out for sure. Within 10 years, the Christians were saying Jesus is alive. And they were doing that at a point where those events were within easy living memory. So anybody who was able to say it's a load of rubbish could have come forward and said so, because it was just very, very recent history. But the fact is, it was believed by thousands of people within just a few weeks, because nobody could say that it wasn't true. But the evidence was that it was, because Jesus was showing himself to hundreds of people. How do we explain the emergence of this new movement based on the claim that in recent living memory, Jesus had risen from the dead? How do you explain it? It wasn't the kind of thing that people in the first century Jewish world believed. They didn't believe in this stuff. No, it was a shock to them. And to believe it was going to put you at risk in the Roman world as well. People died for this. And yet ordinary Christians who made no name for themselves in history were willing to suffer and die because they were so convinced Jesus had risen from the dead, and they weren't willing to deny it. That's how persuaded they were. And many actually did suffer and die for it, and still across the world, thousands of people every year encounter Jesus so powerfully, so life-transformingly, that they are willing to die rather than deny what's happened to them. It's still happening. Jesus is still changing lives. How do we make sense of that? Well, the only sensible explanation is that he really is alive. So there are just 6 facts to put before you, and the facts are powerful, and if we will face the facts, they change everything. Because if this stuff is true, if Jesus really is alive, then we can't dismiss the whole idea of life after death, because Jesus has proved that there's life after death. And if Jesus really has come back from the dead, we can't dismiss Jesus either. He can't be just a fiction or a freak or a failure. He has to be the most significant person in history. Here are the facts that change everything. Now, let me just tell you briefly about the experience that changes everything. Years ago, I had a friend who lectured at university in Nottingham in pharmacy, training chemists and stuff. And he was a nice guy. As far as I could see, he was just kind of a good, solid lecturer. Nothing like earth-shattering, but just good, solid bloke. But then one time, I went round to his house in the evening, and he was usually quite a quiet, understated guy. And I got there, and he was like just kind of zinging with excitement. I don't know if you can zing with excitement. I don't even know what that word means. But he was just like hyper. And I kind of said, Paul, everything okay? What's going on? Here he is, by the way. And he said to me, do you know, in the lab this week, I've just made the most astonishing discovery. Now, honestly, I didn't really understand anything he said after that. But it was something to do with bacteria communicating with each other. That doesn't sound like the most exciting thing in the world to me, but he was like totally excited by it, and he even could draw pretty pictures like that to show you how important this was. Now, I really didn't know what he was on about, but what I do know is that that was an experience that changed everything for my friends. He went from an ordinary, good, solid lecturer in pharmacy to a world authority, to a professor. You can go on the internet now and type his name in, and you get world authority on this and the other. It completely changed his life, an experience that changed everything for him. But you know, that experience is kind of nothing in comparison to the experience that those women had by the empty tomb of Jesus on the first Easter morning. The Jewish day of rest, the Sabbath, was over. And so they hurry off early in the morning with their spices ready to honor the dead body of their friends. They're worried about how to move the big stone that stands over the tomb. They'd seen it rolled across the tomb when Jesus was buried. But then they get there and they arrive to the shock of their lives. The stone has already been moved, and this man in dazzling white, some of the other writers of the Bible say it was an angel, he's sitting there as if he's been waiting for them to come all along. They're like terrified, wouldn't you be, if you were seeing an angel? I guess you probably would. But the angel then speaks to them. We've already read it a couple of times. Verse 6, "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And you know, that experience changed everything for them. And it can change everything for us as well. Why is that? Well, number one, because it means that Jesus is more powerful than death itself. He was dead and buried, but what they discovered is that now he was alive and well. Personally, I've had a pretty awful couple of weeks on this issue. I think it feels like every other day I hear about another story of somebody I know or somebody that I know and they know somebody who's died in difficult circumstances. I think 10 different people in the last kind of 10 days or so. It's really horrible. Earlier in my own life, Alison and I lost our 2 sons. It's horrible. Death is just a horrible thing to have to face. It's been called the ultimate statistic, hasn't it? 1 out of 1 people die. So the idea that Jesus is more powerful than death is actually completely relevant to every one of us, because death is something that we all have to face at different points in our lives. Jesus, more powerful than death. He was crucified, he was dead, he was buried, but he didn't stay in the tomb. He's risen, the angel says. He's not here. Because he's risen, we know there is life after death. And because he's risen, we know that he can carry us through death into eternal life. Now, that doesn't take away the pain of dying or the pain of losing people that we love. But what it does do is shine hope into the darkest places of human experience. Because there is someone stronger than death. And someone who can give us what we need to face the reality of death in our own lives. Jesus, more powerful than death. But it also tells us that Jesus can forgive our failures. I've got to tell you, for me, that is incredibly good news. Because honestly, the more kind of truthful I am with myself, the more I understand just how deep my failures go. You know, people look at me and say, "Oh, no, you're a good guy." Well, they don't know me as well as I know myself. There are plenty of failures deep down inside of me. And I can't sort them out. I'm not strong enough to sort out my failures. I'm really not. But here's the great news. Jesus can forgive our failures. Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends and disciples. And just before Jesus died, Peter had made this bold claim. He said, look, all of the rest of your followers might run away when it gets hard for you, but I'm never going to. I would die rather than deny you. Really bold. But actually, Peter had failed spectacularly, totally denying Jesus 3 times. So did you notice in verse 7, when the angel is talking to the women, go and tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he told you. Peter, the spectacular failure, and Jesus, when he's just got out of the tomb, he's got a plan because he's going to forgive Peter and give him a new start. And if you feel you're the most spectacular failure, don't worry, Jesus can look after you as well. He can give you a new start just like he gave Peter a new start. He can forgive our failures. In fact, that's what his death on the cross was all about. It was all about forgiving our failures. Too many people think that Christians are people who think that they're better than everybody else. It's a load of rubbish. We're not better than everybody else. No, to be a Christian is to face the facts that actually we've messed up. I've messed up. You've messed up. All of us have messed up. But we found in Jesus forgiveness, a new start, because he died on the cross in our place. All of us have messed up. All of us have tried to push God away. That's what the Bible means when it talks about sin. It means pushing God away and putting ourselves in his place because we don't want to be told what to do. All of us have done that, and we deserve to die for it. But Jesus came and died on the cross for us so that we could be forgiven for that and given a whole new start. Our failures left behind us. So your failures and mine, they don't have to define our future anymore. Jesus can forgive them, wash them away, and give us a whole new start. It's great, great news. How do we know it's true? Because the resurrection proves it. The resurrection of Jesus is God's great public out loud yes to all that Jesus has claimed. Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and God raises him from the dead and says, yes, he is. Jesus claimed he could forgive our failures and give us a new start, and God raised him from the dead and said, yes, he can. His death on the cross is really enough to change our lives. And then it also means that Jesus can be trusted. Verse 7, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Do you know, if you can trust someone who says they're going to die and rise from the dead, and they do then die and rise from the dead, if you can trust them about that, then to be honest, you can trust them about anything, can't you? Does that make sense? I mean, people don't die and then rise from the dead. But Jesus did. He said he would, and he did. You can trust him. You can trust him actually with everything. And if you do, your life won't be boring and dull and going nowhere. If you trust him with everything, he'll change your life and give it purpose and direction and significance like you've never had it before. I was just thinking this morning when we were singing one of the great Easter hymns, there's this kind of line in there that says, Jesus meets us, risen from the tomb, lovingly he greets us, scatters fear and gloom. And I was thinking, who is this Jesus that meets us, risen from the tomb? What's he like? Is he the Jesus of religion? Down on everything, dull, always telling you a million things that you really oughtn't to do. It's not the Jesus that I find in the Bible. No, the Jesus who meets us risen from the tomb is the Jesus who is bracingly alive and awesomely powerful and has the most amazing plans to change the whole world and change our lives too. And I just imagine, what would it be like if every day when I got up, I thought, the risen Jesus wants to meet me today and say, hey, John, what adventures are we going to have together? Whose life do you want me to work in today? Where am I going to take you? Where I'm going to show my power? Jesus meets us, risen from the tomb. You can trust him. You can trust him to direct your life. You can trust him to give meaning and significance to your life. You can trust him that if he meets you and if you obey him, your life is never going to be dull, because Jesus is never dull. He is always on the move. He's always changing us. Sorry, I didn't mean to say any of that. I've kind of got excited and lost my track. But let's get back on track now. So Jesus, more powerful than death, forgiving us our failures, we can trust him. It's great news. Finding eternal life, finding forgiveness, finding a God you can trust. That's what happened to those women beside the empty tomb of Jesus. That was the experience that changed everything for them and can change everything for me and for you. Finally, and just quickly, the choice that changes everything. Do you remember I started off telling you about that letter that landed on my door 15 years ago, almost exactly 15 years ago? But just towards the end, it pretty much finished with these words. Having invited me to come down, it said, "The details of your contract will be forwarded to you should you accept the post offered. We look forward to receiving your reply." In other words, I had a life-defining choice to make. And you know, there is a far more life-defining choice to make in the light of the resurrection of Jesus. And you can see that choice here in the contrast between the boldness of Joseph, who we read about in chapter 15, who buried Jesus in his own tomb, and the fear of the women who ran away and, at least initially, kept stum about him. Joseph, that unexpected believer, he risked trouble with the Roman authorities. It wasn't a very good idea to kind of say you were following someone who had just been crucified as an enemy of the Roman state. He also risked trouble with his own people. He belonged to the council that had just condemned Jesus to death. And yet, chapter 15, verse 43, he goes to Pilate. He goes boldly to Pilate and asks him for Jesus' body. He's kind of come out as a disciple of Jesus. And boldly he goes and says to Pilate, "I want to have that body." In comparison, have a look at chapter 16, verse 8, where the women, trembling and bewildered, went out and ran from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And actually, that's really where the whole of Mark's gospel finishes. And it's a bit of an odd place to finish, not least because we know that the women didn't keep their silence for long. They found their courage and they did go and tell people. But Mark doesn't take us that far. He just kind of lets the whole thing hang here. And maybe he does that because he's asking us to finish the story. Because he's asking us to make our own choice. Which of these two responses will be ours? Will we run away from Jesus, afraid of what it might cost us to face the facts of his empty tomb? Or will we respond with the unlikely faith of Joseph, boldly coming out as a disciple of Jesus, risking the opposition of our friends and our enemies to embrace the truth that changes everything? Can I ask you this evening, which is it for you? Which choice are you going to make? You've seen the facts. You've heard about the experience. Now, which choice are you going to make? Run away in fear or come out as a disciple of Jesus, trusting him for forgiveness through his death on the cross, trusting him for new life through the power of his resurrection, trusting him to overturn your values and reshape your whole future as you set out on a new life to change the world with him. That's the choice. It's the choice that will change everything for you. It's the best choice you can make. And on this Easter day, you have the opportunity to make that choice. Run from Jesus or run to him. Give in to fear or give way to faith. Which will it be for you? Alison's going to come and lead us as we respond to the good news. Thanks.